Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to this webinar that we have today. It's great to have you with us. My name is Aisha Tambajang, and I'm joining you from Humentum. I'll be doing some webinar support for the session. The session, as you know, is part of our Innovation Towards a Viable Futures webinar series, where we create a space for reflection for organizations and the needs that they have right now, not just responding to change, but also navigating the ways in which they can do that in a grounded, practical, and sustainable way. Before we begin our webinar and I hand over to my colleague Kim, I'd like to thank our sponsor, our presenting sponsor, StoneX. We're thrilled to have StoneX as our presenting sponsor for this series. StoneX Payments helps NGOs complete cross-border payments to help developing countries with ease. The global network of 385 plus correspondent banks allows them to deliver transparent, secure, and guaranteed payments in over 140 currencies across the global south and 180 countries. For more than 35 years, and they have supported more than 1,500 non-for-profits globally. A quick housekeeping notes before we start. The webinar is going to be recorded and will be shared afterwards, including on YouTube and in a follow-up email. We encourage you all to engage with us through the chat, share reflections, questions, or examples of some of the things that emerged from the discussion with our panelist. And yes, we're very happy to have you all involved, and I will give it over to my colleague Kim to set the scene for the webinar that we have. Thank you.
Thanks, Aisha. It's so nice to have everybody here. You are very welcome. Yes, why are we here? The title of this webinar is Living Values During Crisis. How do we walk the talk when survival is on the line? It's something that I've been thinking and talking about for quite a while, and happy to really dig in with the folks here on this call. So when I was growing up, my dad always said, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. It was an expression that followed me around my whole life. I often questioned what that actually meant in real life. And I think that today we're going to here to have a conversation about what happens when the going gets tough, because for a lot of us, that's the situation that we are in. There's the tough situation that you are in might look like having to make hard decisions about staffing, having to make hard decisions about programming or partnerships. It might look like hard trade-offs in an environment that is both complex and uncertain. So uncertain funding, compressed timelines, multiple possible futures that we're still figuring out in real time. And so in the last year and a half and beyond, everything that I have seen and done and everyone that I have talked to point to the fact that in times of disruption, how we act matters as much, if not more so, than what we do. And so that really is where living our values comes in. And so the question that I put out here is not, do we have values? Because almost all organizations do. They're in your strategy, they're on your webpage, they may even be on your wall. The question is, what happens to those values when things get hard? Do they guide your decisions? Or do they kind of quietly get set to the side in the name of urgency or survival? And so just to be clear, this is not about calling anyone out. It's not about calling our panelist for the webinar. It's not about making anyone who's listening feel bad. It's really just starting to get honest about the reality that we are all navigating right now. Because the truth is, this is actually where our values are going to show up the most. They show up in the trade-offs. They don't show up just on the webpage. And so this is a holding space and creating space so that we can talk about things like where our values are feeling stretched, what's actually in our control and what's not in our control, and then what it's like to stay aligned to our values, even if it costs something. And so that is the conversation that I would love to have with you all today. I'd like to introduce my colleagues here on the call. I'm actually going to ask you all to introduce yourselves because I don't think I can do you justice. And this is what I'm going to ask you to do. If you could please introduce yourself and share how you're showing up to this conversation. And I truly invite you to interpret that in as however you see fit. So how are you showing up to this conversation on living your values when times get tough? That might be your location, it might be your identity, it might be the role that you play in your organization, or in your job, because all of those different things play a role in what your core values are, right? What matters most to you and how you're able to live them through how you behave, with the decisions you make, your leadership style, etc. So let's go alphabetically. Let's go Anu, Asier, and then Cecilia. Please feel free to introduce yourselves.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kim, and thank you everyone for joining. I look forward to the discussion. I'm Anu Kumar. I'm President and CEO of IPASS. IPASS is a global reproductive justice organization that focuses on access to safe abortion and contraception around the world. I've been with the organization for quite a while, over 20 years at this point. So, how am I showing up to this conversation? I have to say, I feel a little underprepared, and so I've been traveling a lot for the last couple of weeks. So I'm not I'm less prepared than I would like to be, but I'm hoping that my lived experience and in both my current role, but my many years at IPASS will help, and that you all will help me as well in prompting my reflections and thinking on this topic.
How about you, Asier?
Okay. Hi to everyone. Thanks a lot for this opportunity. My name is Asir Hernando. I'm the co-director of ACAPACA. ACAPACA is a platform of Latin American social movements to try to transform the international cooperation system. We start 3 years ago when we start seeing like that we need to transform that system because the system wasn't working in the way that Latin American social movements and organizations need. In the past, I've been for 20 years working at Oxfam as in Latin America, always as regional director and campaign director, and I lead the last 3 internal transformation of Oxfam International in the region. So I have those experiences also. But here I think that I'm going to speak about the reflection that we have in Latin America where I live with Latin American social movements and an organization here on the transformation that we are leading of the international cooperation system. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot, Kim. And I've been for 1 year and a half working and participating in the different debates and reflection together with Momentum. So thanks a lot for that, Kim. That was so useful here for this region and for me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And Cecilia.
Thanks, Kim. Hi, everyone. I'm Cecilia Lero. I am a program manager with the Network Grants team at Open Society Foundations. So OSF is a large private philanthropy that works on rights, justice, and equity. And in Network Grants, we work for cross-regionally and cross-thematically for the long-term strength of civil society. So I'm showing up really excited to hear the other inputs and to maybe get some more insights on how we all figure this big mess out together.
Yeah, and I think thank you for that, Cecilia. And I think to your kind of point, Anu, about feeling kind of unprepared, I don't think any of us are prepared right now. And so this is less about having answers and more about having honest conversations about where it gets hard. And there are no easy answers. If there were easy answers, we would not be having this conversation right now. So I think often unpacking where the tensions are is richer and more useful than saying this is what all the answers is. So you are in good company. I know all 3 of you. Personally, I've had conversations about this topic with you all, so I know you're thinking about it on a regular basis. All right, let's go ahead. The way that we will work is the 4 of us will talk together for about the next 30-ish minutes, and then we'll take questions. But if you are listening, please feel free to put your questions in the chat as they come up, and we'll weave them into the conversation as makes sense. So I really I want to hear from your perspectives about kind of what the problem is, what it feels like, what it looks like right now from your respective positions to start with. So we came here to talk about living values during times of crisis or transition, and specifically how to walk the talk when survival is on the line. So I'm interested to hear how you see the problem from where you sit. Um, so I guess to begin with, from in your role, where are you currently seeing your values that are being most tested or stretched during kind of moments of crisis? Where are those tensions showing up? And maybe Asier, we can start with you. You're on mute, but I can see your hands moving. So you're into it.
Sorry, yes. I could start just with a few reflections to start the conversation, and then I could go deeper. I think that the main challenge that I see right now is when we need to choose between survival and our principles. And this is the huge dilemma that we have in many organizations with the professionals that we have in many organizations. And I want, I prefer to go like in the and in the places where we have much more this tension is in international NGOs. So between international NGOs or intermediaries in the system, or national civil society organizations, or donors and foundations. So we are transforming all the system. But where I see this tension mainly is in intermediaries, is in international NGOs, because many professionals working there, to if they maintain their principle, they will lose their works, and they don't see alternatives to the work that they have right now. So this is a huge tension to maintain the principles in the transformation of the system that all of us we need. That we think I don't see this tension in Latin American social movements, because most of them they don't have the leaders working in the Latin American social movement, they don't have an economic dependency with the movement per se. So in those cases, it's much easier to then to adapt to the transformation that the sector is living right now. Let's start just with this reflection, and then I could continue with more.
Yeah, it's interesting. Movements don't have the tension because they don't have the economic dependency. We could dig into that a little bit if we want to. Anu, maybe do you want to go next?
Sure. So in thinking about your question, Kim, IPAS isn't at the moment anyway in survival mode, for a couple of reasons. We did not ever receive US government funding, so the pulling away of those funds did not disrupt our revenue picture, though it did disrupt our overall picture in terms of what's happening in the global health sector, which has been extremely disruptive. Um, and then, but of course, we have experienced in the past funding cuts that have been, that were sort of existential or felt that way, at least at the time. And so, had to make extremely challenging decisions at that juncture. And I would say that right now, the survival that we're thinking about, or the crisis that we're dealing with more, is really the crisis around civil society more generally, for organizations based in the US, but of course beyond that, because the space for civil society, as we've been noting, is shrinking, and has been shrinking and has been actively reduced, not just in terms of resources, but also in terms of access to decision makers and policymakers. So that's a kind of a long-standing crisis, but I think it's definitely been made worse for US-based organizations by the current administration. So, in thinking about those two situations, I feel like the values that come into play, and you're right, IPAS does have organizational core values. And then I have sort of my own values, and how I want to lead an organization, how I want to behave as a leader within an organization. But I have to say that those values are often um, they're often put to a test because we're making decisions quickly, or we feel like we need to make decisions quickly because we don't have enough information. This is really often the case, is that we just don't know enough, and we try to get as much information as we can, but we don't often know whether it's the right information, whether it's, if we ask somebody else, like I'm thinking, for example, about lawyers. You ask one lawyer one thing and you get one set of information, then you ask another lawyer the same thing, you might get another opinion. And then you're sort of stuck in terms of having to figure out how to navigate the information that you're getting. So I think it's in those moments that you kind of really have to go back to your values, both organizational values, but also your personal values, and think about why am I here? Sort of an existential question. But what is my role in this moment in this organization? What is my obligation? How do I navigate through this situation of complete or incomplete information? So I mean, that's what I try to do. I don't by any means think that I have done it particularly well. I think I've gone through it multiple times with different sorts of crises, and so I've learned things along the way. But it is not something that I mean, I know that Humentum put out a workbook on values. I think that's great, and I think it's probably quite helpful. But I certainly don't feel like I'm an expert on that.
Thank you for reminding me. I just put the link in the chat. Yes, we did. We did a whole bunch of co-creation work on thinking about this. So this is why I say I've been thinking about this for quite a while. It is more questions than answers. It's a guide and a workbook that really just helps you to think through the process. Just what you said on it, which is, it's not that I have the answers, but am I being deliberate and intentional about it? So at least when I make the trade-offs, it's kind of with eyes wide open. Okay, what I heard from you is incomplete information, real complexity,
Yeah.
going back to values.
Yeah, and I just want to add one other thing, which
Please.
an acronym that I've been using a little bit more frequently in communicating with colleagues as well as my board, which is, you probably heard, it's called BANI.
No, say more.
It's BANI. I think it comes from one of these business, either Harvard Business Review or Stanford Social Innovation Review. Anyway, it stands for, it's kind of a description of our current environment. And it stands for brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. And it sort of, to me, is apt in terms of where we are in our world. I used to use this one called VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I would show this, this photograph of a volcano erupting, VUCA. But we've actually transitioned, I feel like, into this other BANI acronym where everyone, this is sort of a description of how we are as people. We're brittle, anxious, we're nonlinear, and we're often incomprehensible, but it's also the environment in which we find ourselves operating.
I love that, because I was gonna mention VUCA, but this BANI is both kind of systems and personal, which is really interesting. Cecilia, please share your thoughts. Where are you seeing kind of values most tested or stressed these days?
Sure. So from where I sit in a place of privilege in the current situation because we're a private foundation. Our funding is not affected by the global contraction. But what that means is that the demand we're facing has multiplied exponentially, which means that we have to make harder decisions. Our team put forth our strategy. We're a relatively new team, less than 2 years old, but most of our strategy was focused around how can we work with partners and provide support in a way that's transformational, that's outside the box, that pushes the future of civil society. What we're finding now is that we're being asked to fill a lot of gaps that organizations that were stalwarts in the ecosystem have come to us on the brink of in the fight for survival. And so the tension that we feel in our values is how do we strike a balance between it, not letting go of those actors that are key in the field, like without whom entire ecosystems would collapse, without and balancing that with supporting the new and exciting ideas that are going to hopefully be like a hook or a strap to help get us out of this, what we're mired in now, and build the thing that is new. Um, and it's of course difficult because uh, we can't possibly fill all the gaps that have been left by private philanthropy as a whole, can't fill all the gaps that have been left by the bilaterals. So we really need to uh, figure out a new way to do stuff. But when these tried and true organizations are coming to you, how do you say no? Um, Another thing that I think is affecting not just OSF, but a lot of our a lot of other funders and intermediary and ground level organizations are contractions in staffing. That's something we're seeing sector wide. So while we want to at OSF be risk acceptance, while we want to find the new and ideas that are sprouting in uncommon places, that requires a lot of staff time and a lot of exploration. So our values are tested in that the structural incentives are there to fund who's always gotten funding, to fund sort of the safe bets. And so we're constantly having to go back and saying, no, we want to embrace risk and put in that hard work.
Thank you all. So I set this conversation up talking about survival, and you all just to feedback what I'm hearing from you, expanded where the tensions are and where values are coming in. So yes, survival in terms of financial survival for sure, for many probably on this call. But also I heard purpose. I heard, why are we actually here? I heard kind of this existential question about civil society and the social contract of civil society being at risk. And I heard, as a leader, how am I making decisions, and the structural incentives and risk. And going back over and over again to how are we prioritizing our time? How are we using our time? How are we going back to our role at both the organizational and structural level, but then also within ourselves as leaders. So I'm going to set that up for us as this is part of the problem. These are all, and then as Anu said, in a Bonnie world, right? In a world where there is incomplete information, fast-paced complexity, and so much uncertainty where we don't know what we don't know. And it's not that the world we were living in before was ever easy. I would say it was complex, but at a global scale, I think the level of complexity is the incomprehensibleness has increased. So what does this all mean? What I have found in the last year or so, talking to many, many people, is that it's really easy to talk about, okay, this is what's wrong, right? So we just started saying, where is it hard? What is wrong with the system? Where are things hard? And it's also easy to talk about the big fixes, right? So what they need to do outside of my sphere of control, what do the powers that be or the system need to do to fix it? We love to fall in love with the problem. Sometimes we love to fall in love with the problem too much, right? Because it's out of our control. And when that happens, from what I have seen, it leaves people feeling overwhelmed and helpless. And the opposite of overwhelm is clarity, and the opposite of helplessness is empowerment. So I'm going to ask the three of you to help those who are listening feel more clarity and more empowered. By talking a little bit, I know your face, by talking a little bit about what is within your sphere of control. So within your space that you are doing, what are you empowered to do? if you kind of thought practically based from your experience, what's one action that someone in your role, whether that's the seat or the perspective within the ecosystem, so funder, civil society, INGO, etc., or the role, manager, CEO, etc., can take, whether it's this week, whether it's month, to kind of live their values and align their behaviors? What's one thing that someone could do that you have experienced yourself? And I'm going to open this up to whoever has, however, something that comes to mind. Otherwise, I'll call on you.
Do you want to start, Tanu? And then I continue. Please go ahead.
Okay. So what is one thing that I can do? I will just share what I can do, not what you can do. So what I can do is I can control my own behavior and I can control how I communicate. So I try to do that. I try to be as open and honest as I can be in my communication. I am the CEO of iPass, so I do have some authority within the organization. Not full authority and not complete authority. And I think that's important to bear in mind. It's an organization that has a lot of very talented people. And but how I show up and how I behave matters. And so I try to keep that in mind. And it's something that I've learned in my role as a leader, not just a CEO, but as a leader in the organization for quite some time, that what I say actually has a deep impact in what people absorb and hear, both internally and externally. So I try to be thoughtful about that.
Thanks
I
for
can
that.
add on to that. So I think
Mm.
something that I've certainly striven to do, as Anu said, is to understand the limits and the possibilities of authority that I have. I think a lot of people in large institutions, like the one I work in, oftentimes we complain about our institutional limits. And we lament about them instead of thinking, well, what actually is within my power that I can change? And so some of the things that I can do, I can't, change the overall budget of my program as much as I wish I could. But what I can do is think about the other resources that are available to me, whether it be the networks that I have, whether it be the networks that our partners and our funded partners have, and the way that I can uh, sort of do matchmaking among them to make sure that connections are happening in ways that were unforeseen or that are not the norm. Um, uh, so yeah,
Mm.
and that also involves me taking the extra effort to really understand well what my partners are doing so that I have it in the back of my head. When this opportunity arises, I'm going to email them, I'm going to send them a signal message,
Mm.
so that they can take advantage of an opportunity that I maybe can't provide, but that I can alert them to.
Yeah, I love
Mm.
that. The informal kind of connecting, weaving,
Mm.
networking spaces are so valuable. And this is a time where maybe before, and I'm not saying that you're doing that, that you
Mm.
would have done this, Cecilia, but where before there might have been gatekeeping of information and knowledge, I am seeing more and more people leaning into being connective and collaborative, which is
Mm.
definitely a positive of these times. Asier, what would you add?
Yes, I would like to continue with some of the same ideas, but here I think that for us was so important. One key idea is prepare ourselves to die as an organization, and we reduce our anxiety because of that. And we learned that with our organizations in Medellin, and they prepare us as organization to die, and we have the reflection that in 3 years we will reflect and decide together if we want to continue as organization or not. Okay, so we don't have like the survival anxiety right now, and I think that we could take better decisions, and we could manage better the context that we have right now. Um, I think also here, like we always repeat, we love utopias, we hate dystopias. So we like to dream here. We like to dream. We know that the context now is so hard, and we need to take decision because of this context, and we have the context analysis that we need, but we love utopia. We love to think that the future will be better, and we want to build for this future. Okay, and this is also so important to maintain our principles and to be close to our principles, because our principles are close to those utopias. And then it's important also to be practical. And we know that with the context that we have right now, we want to be as independent as possible, as individuals and as organization. Because when you are independent, you have the capacity to be closer to your principles. So as an organization, we try to diversify our different donors. We work with different consultancies. We have like different type of work, and as individuals, also we balance the role that we play in our organizations with the role that we play as professors in the universities and other different roles. And this be practical with your values is so important with the context that you have right now, and try to have as less dependencies as possible.
Did you want to add to that, Anu?
Yeah, I think that does really resonate with me. I think I think one thing that you do have within your control is to try to anticipate what's going to happen and to be as proactive as you possibly can be, so that you're not in a reactive, panicked mode. Many of us can predict, or at least have some ideas of what's going to happen. You may not be able to predict exactly what's going to happen, but you can certainly anticipate or at least think through a worst case scenario. I mean, that's the essence of risk analysis and risk planning, right? So if you can do that and then make plans accordingly on your own without being forced to, then you have more control over both the process and the outcome that you seek. That does require a clarity of vision, and that can be challenging when you don't have the information that you need always. But I think that kind of foresight, or at least just ability to imagine the possibilities that occur and how you would navigate it, even if it's done as an exercise. I was recently, actually, Kim, and you and I were both at the Scholar World Forum, and one of the sessions I attended there was about this, and they actually had us walk through a exercise of, we're kind of this risk, this thing just happened to your organization. How would you react? And even just walking through a tabletop exercise gets you in this mode of like thinking through, what would I do first? What would I do second? How would I bring in? How would I handle it? And it makes it less scary, and less fraught when it actually happens, or if it actually happens.
Yeah, I mean, I like that example, especially because many people are probably going through that right now, right? Which is trying to anticipate what can happen, and there might be 5 or 6 potential futures on the table, and we don't know which one. And the conversations that you mentioned we've been having with many people is thinking about, okay, in those, let's say, 6 scenarios, are there any no regret options for you to make? So are there any no regret actions that will move you in the same direction towards your vision, towards your dreams, towards what you're trying to build in any of those potential scenarios? Those are your no regret moves, and you can with confidence start to kind of put those in place. And then the question is, as you're thinking about it, how are you bringing your values in? So if one of your values is equity and inclusion, who should be at the table to be making those conversations? Who's not at the table and should be at the table to be making those conversations? How are we living our values in the process of navigating this? And so doing that kind of tabletop exercise, I think is a really good example. I'm seeing some questions come in, and some of them are really interesting, and I want to get to them. I want to ask you one thing first, which is, do you have an example that comes to mind where you have chosen alignment over convenience recently, even if it was a cost? Where has there been an example of an uncomfortable trade-off that you had to make? I'm seeing nods.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of constant, right? I mean, I don't really have an example of when I haven't had to compromise in some way. You think about the organization that I'm with, IPASS is about reproductive justice, right? And we are therefore thinking about how do we create a world where everyone has human rights. This is a pretty idealistic scenario, and it is one where we are constantly rubbing up against reality, and whether that reality is a broader reality of our political environment or a smaller reality of how the funding flows operate in our sector, it's still a reality. And so we're kind of, I think, constantly having to decide what do we do? And a recent example is a donor wanting us to pick particular countries to operate in, where we said, no, actually, we would prefer to work in a broader number of countries rather than the few that you select. They definitely did not want us to work in Latin America. We did want to work in Latin, so that kind of negotiation back and forth of what is important to us, how do we bring our collective to the fore, we made the decisions that we made, but they're not necessarily there's no right or wrong in these decisions. And we'll never know whether if we had listened to exactly what the donors said, would we have been more successful in getting funding? Maybe, but we would have sacrificed something along the road. But we don't know. We don't know the answer to that question. So I guess I'm thinking that there are very, very few times in my 20 plus years of this organization where I have been able to do exactly what I want and exactly what the organization wants to do without compromise.
Yeah.
I think that I came from Mexico and and had this reflection with many of the Mexican civil society in a process that OSF is supporting. And I think that was a great process, because one of the reflections that the civil society from Mexico had was that it's important to not to be very rigid. If you want to maintain your values, it's important to not to be very rigid with your values right now. For example, if the international cooperation will disappear in the future, and in Mexico was disappearing the last 10 years, okay, they need to rethink their business models, and they need to rethink, for example, the relation that civil society in Mexico has with private sector, and they need to open the approaches and not their values. They want to maintain their values, but they need to open their mindset about the private sector in Mexico. And they are doing this reflection, and they are doing this reflection together, not organization per organization, together. And I think that this is a great example for that. So try to not to be very rigid, try to open your mindset, and try to connect with other stakeholders that probably you didn't do in the past, and it's important to do now.
Yeah, great example. Cecilia, do you have an example?
Sure, so many trade-offs. So I can give you an external one. For many years, OSF has supported organizations whose main role and function is to strengthen international human rights law and the multilateral system. we're all believers in international human rights law. We think it's important. It's an important framework and building block, even given the colonial legacies, etc. However, we are at a point now where we're really questioning the efficacy and what is the proper balance of time and effort we should put into formal engagement versus grassroots power building. What is the balance? How should they go together? And so and this is something I alluded to earlier, the trade-offs of supporting organizations that have had great gains in the past 30 odd years in international law, but are maybe struggling to meet the moment and to reframe the way that they show up in a situation where institutional legitimacy is being questioned across the board. I think that's a huge tension that we face. And then internally, we also face a tension between, again, I alluded to this already, between risk and uh, uh, like even organizational survival. OSF is under attack. I think everyone knows that. We have not changed our funding strategy. We have not changed the way that we show up, but it's also there's also a trade-off between how out there and vocal are we? We hear from some folks that we need OSF to be more vocal, standing up, and really espousing and promulgating its values at this time. And we hear from others that the more out there that OSF is, the more that they get in trouble for being associated with us. So these are tensions that we're constantly trying to navigate in coordination with the folks that we work with.
Yeah, voice and showing up, and especially in these times, is a real trade-off. And I mean, there are so many examples in the last 2 years that have come up on where you draw that line and what you do. I think that's a really good example. I don't have the answer, but I second that, and I think that's something that if folks want to continue the conversation, we certainly can. There's a question here in the chat that I think that I'd like to pull out because I've already heard it from all three of you already. And it says, how can small community-based organizations maintain alignment with their values when funding structures often push them towards short-term outputs rather than addressing deeper systemic issues? And the kind of theme that I'm hearing that I've already heard from you all are a couple things. The first is short-term versus long-term, right? So kind of business as usual, how do you maintain the programs that you have versus kind of the long-term view, and thinking about what you want to build. So how do you stay alive while also building something new? And the second is kind of surface level outputs and like deeper systemic issues. How do you live your values and balance those when the kind of incentives and structures are pushing you in one way?
Yeah, so I think that this is a very common issue that we also face when we're in the business of long-term transformational systemic change. But we get pressure from funders, from boards, to show short-term results. The best way that we're trying to do it, at least speaking for us, is that your long-term goals should have short-term signals, right? So uh, um, there needs to be a way to understand that a long-term strategy is made of also of like short-term milestones. And those short-term milestones might have different ranges in how tangible they are, but there need to be signals that tell me we're going in the right direction or I need to shift. And so the better that we're able to understand those short-term milestones and design our programs in a way that those add up to something longer and transformational, I think that's the more successful that we can be.
Yeah, if I could chime in there as well. So unfortunately, it's not just small community-based organizations that have this struggle. we also struggle with finding resources to support our long-term ecosystem approach, not just short-term project-based funding. So I can relate to this question and to this challenge. So the things that I think can be helpful are having that long-term vision, being really clear and articulate about what your vision is and what you identify as the systemic issues and how your organization works to address those systemic issues. And having that, written down in a way that's easily understandable or shareable. I think seeking core funding is really the key. You need to identify donors that actually do core funding and go after them with a serious focus. That's tough, but they are out there. And then partnerships, seek partnerships with not just other community-based organizations, but potentially larger organizations and others that can help you parlay their relationships for you and try to help you in finding the resources that will support your long-term vision. But I think this is a struggle for the sector and as a whole. We all struggle with how do we make the kind of change that we're talking about, which is long-term systemic change, when all we ever get is annual funding, or 2 years worth of funding with an enormous number of deliverables attached to it and metrics. This is the conundrum of being in the nonprofit sector.
Yes, I fully agree with Cecilia, with Anu. I think that it's important to have a plan, a long-term plan, to fail to carry out the plan. But it's important to have the plan, and it's important to have the plan because when you think as a team in the plan that you want, you work in a common vision for your future, and you know that you will fail with that, but it's also very, very important to fail on that. And I think that it's important. We need to rethink, all of us, our business models, and as with the proposals that Anu and Cecilia said, without rethinking our business model, thinking that this is just a short-term crisis and we will come again to the reality that we have 2 years, or we will fail for sure with the plan, with our organization, with your team, and with your lives. So yes, it's important to know that we are starting a new era, and we need to adapt our new era, rethinking in the role that we could play as organization in the new reality that we have right now, and rethinking our business model, taking into account our possibilities as organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the one hand, what I'm hearing is what you said is before, Asier, how do you balance short-term action with long-term dreaming? You need to have the dream, you need to have the vision, whether you call that a dream or a vision or, what your long-term thing that you're building is. And as you said, Anu, this is not new. This is not a new tension. Of course, we could have been having the same conversation 10 years ago or more. I think what's new about it now is there's actually an opportunity to build something new out of it. So while the constraints of the old system are still there is the possibility of us in that dream building something new. And so the kind of challenge that I am constantly putting out to people and kind of gently probing is, if you were doing that, what role do values play? How are you living those principles and values as you're building something new, even while we're working in that kind of 2-year project cycle? It does add another layer of complexity and anxiety onto things, but there's also a layer of hope and opportunity, I think, which is why people are increasingly talking about it. I think we have time for one more kind of set of conversation, and there is a grouping in the chat of questions that are more internally facing around values. And if I could kind of put a few of the questions together, it's around headquarters and country offices or regional office. It's around global north, global south. It's around power dynamics and values within organizations. It's coming up in the questions around how decisions are made, who is having a seat at the table, compensation, titles, all of these things. You know, I might carry senior responsibilities, but it's not reflected in roles or recognition or remuneration. You have a seat at the table, but you still feel like less. Someone said, we always have made decisions to downsize our field teams at the end of a project without hesitation, but all of a sudden we're talking about how hard these decisions are when we are laying off headquarters staff. So these are internal questions around how we live our values from an operational sense. And I'm wondering, and I know you all have wrestled with these before kind of this last sense period of disruption, but I'm interested to hear your kind of thoughts, reactions, or responses to what you're seeing in the chat. Maybe we will go Anu, Asier, and then Cecilia.
Sorry, couldn't find my mute button there. Yeah, I think these are some really big issues. One that we're grappling with at IPAS now. We have made a commitment organizationally to shared leadership in terms of our management approach, but how we actually live into that in terms of the process and the mechanics is something that we're still figuring out. And I think this tension between, organizational level work versus country work is really challenging. I think more and more the dichotomy between whatever we consider global or versus the field, as it used to be called, that dichotomy, I think, is less and less useful. One of the things that's happened to us over time is that we are hiring global staff that are not in Europe or the US or Canada. They are actually global staff. They're actually based in other parts of the world. And what is it fair to compensate them is a really open question for us right now, and it's one that's been a source of a lot of tension internally. So I don't think I'm sorry to say I don't have an answer for this, but I think this is very much in flux and in motion right now. And the thing that's interesting to me about it is that when I ask other organizations what they're doing, and I ask HR professionals what their recommendations are, nobody knows. Nobody seems to have a really good answer to this. And there isn't a lot of data around, so I can draw upon this. So we're back to making a decision, I think, that really is about what do we think is right. And this is where it gets really tough. What can we afford? And so I think that those are the things that are, that are kind of in my mind at the moment in terms of how do we handle this. I'd love to hear if others have grappled with this and how they've come out with this, Asier or Cecilia.
Yes, I agree. Well, two things more that I think that are important that I saw many times. I saw at Oxfam many times. Granularity, I think that is important in those kind of in operational processes. So try to be as specific as possible in the decisions, and then explain and explain and explain many times the decisions that you are taking, why you are taking the decisions. And in the thing that you have the responses, and in the thing where you don't have the responses, but it's important to explain that you don't have the responses, or you don't have the consistency that you would like to have. But so granularity and the importance of communicates, I think, in those kind of decisions, I think that are two key elements for that.
Yeah, I think this is a serious issue. So before I joined OSF, I was a civil society activist based in the Philippines, and basically resigned myself to the idea that I would be a precarious worker for the rest of my life before I knew that this career option was available. And I think that also leads to issues of, frankly, brain drain and moving people from the south to the north. At OSF, we've been through restructures and are still going through attempts to hire more in the South and transfer people who back to the countries that either that they came from if they were moved to the North, or to other countries if they want to go. It's definitely not perfect. Um, uh, but I think it requires a lot of effort on the part of both management as well as us as staff that participate in hiring processes to be attuned to the different needs and the different ways of working. When I work on a global team, we span like 11 time zones. And so we have to be really flexible. Like, it's not fair to ask colleagues in Asia to always stay up late nights, right? So all of these are considerations that I think uh, I'm seeing more effort to address them. But I think something that on an individual level, at least I can do is to stand up and have solidarity with my coworkers who are based in other offices, to also speak up when they have complaints or they have concerns about the degree to which their voices are being heard in global decisions. And I think that we're uh, um, especially since we, for the first time, have a president that's from the South, we're on the right track going there, although it's, again, not easy.
So believe it or not, we're at time, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. But I would like to say this from a few takeaways that I'm getting from just listening to you all in this conversation. The first is that this is not a new conversation. We have been grappling with many of these challenges and thinking about values for, I think, as long as the work has been done. And what's new about this moment in time is the level of complexity, the level of uncertainty and upheaval, and also maybe this window of opportunity to actually do things differently if we keep values front and center. And then the final thing that I have enjoyed hearing from you is giving really practical examples of living values at a tactical, tangible, granular level, that they're not just some sweeping things that we live in, although we do need to dream, but it's also practically living them where they come to life. So thank you for sharing those examples and being open about the trade-offs that you make. I'm going to put the resources in the chat one more time, and then I'm going to hand it over to Aisha to close us out.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim, and thank you to all the speakers for joining. It was such a thoughtful discussion. My brain was in a very reflective mode, so it's always a great conversation to be in when you feel that way. Thank you all for joining us today. And just quickly before we close, I wanted to make a quick note about Momentum. We're a global non-for-profit supporting social good organizations through trainings, practical consulting, and membership platforms that offers peer learning tools in over 200 courses to help you sustain, scale, or pivot in the complex environments. You can follow us on LinkedIn, and you can also visit our website, momentum.org. As I mentioned, this webinar is part of a webinar series that we have, and our next webinar is going to be on June 2nd, and it's titled Revenue Resilience, Fee-for-Fee Service, Hybrid Models, and Diversification. And we'll be sending that in the follow-up email that we're sharing to you all, and we hope that you can also join that webinar. And again, thank you very much for your time, and I wish you a good rest of your day. Bye-bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
folks. We'll see you next time.
Thanks. Bye.